Linda Park arrived at Fort Davidson on a Tuesday morning that felt colder than usual, carrying nothing but a worn leather briefcase and a thermos of coffee that had seen better days. The security guard barely glanced at her credentials before waving her through the gate. At first glance, she seemed utterly out of place among the hardened infantry soldiers who called this base home. Standing barely 5'4" with graying hair pulled into a neat bun, Linda wore wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down her nose. Her voice was soft, almost whispered, requiring everyone to lean in during her presentations. She dressed in pressed khakis and sensible walking shoes, looking more like a small-town librarian than someone who belonged on a military installation. Her mission seemed straightforward enough: train soldiers in logistics, field medical procedures, emergency protocols, and military regulations. The kind of desk work that kept everyone safe, but never made headlines. Linda's presentations were masterpieces of organization, every slide perfectly formatted, every diagram color-coded and labeled with precision that bordered on obsessive. She arrived 30 minutes early to every session, testing equipment, arranging chairs in precise rows, and ensuring the room temperature was comfortable. When soldiers dozed off during supply chain management sessions, she'd gently wake them with a shoulder tap and a warm smile. "This could save your life someday," she'd whisper, never showing irritation at their disinterest. But respect was something entirely different. PowerPoint lady, that's what they called her behind closed doors during mess hall conversations. They'd mimic her gentle voice and pretend to click an invisible remote. "Please turn to slide number 7, they joke, causing eruptions of laughter that echoed through the dining hall. Linda never reacted, never showed any sign she heard their mockery. She simply continued her work with the same quiet dedication, staying late to reorganize scattered equipment and rewrite outdated training manuals that nobody bothered reading. What they didn't notice was how her eyes scanned rooms like tactical assessments, how she positioned herself with clear sight lines to exits, or how her seemingly casual stance was actually a ready position. These soldiers had no idea their PowerPoint lady had once moved through jungles where silence meant survival, where one wrong step meant death for entire teams. The first warning sign came during a routine equipment check. Linda was examining a field medical kit when she paused, frowning at the contents. "These tourniquets are the wrong specification," she mentioned quietly to Sergeant Martinez, who was overseeing the inventory. Martinez barely looked up from his clipboard. "They're standard issue, ma'am. Been using them for years." "The tensioning mechanism is outdated," Linda pressed gently. "In a real emergency, these could fail under pressure. I'm sure you've seen a lot of things in your training videos." Martinez cut her off with a dismissive smile. "But out here, we trust what's worked for us in the field." Linda nodded silently, but something flickered in her quiet eyes, a recognition of a much darker truth that she couldn't yet share. The disrespect escalated gradually. During field exercises, instead of consulting her as the designated advisor, commanding officers assigned her to distribute water bottles and count supplies. When she offered tactical suggestions based on protocols she claimed to have studied, they'd nod politely and ignore her completely. Lieutenant Morrison made it his personal mission to undermine her authority at every opportunity. He was young, cocky, and fresh from a deployment that had inflated his ego beyond reason. One afternoon, while Linda was setting up a first aid demonstration, Morrison announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "I hope nobody's bleeding out while we wait for Nurse PowerPoint to find the right slide." The room exploded in laughter. Linda paused, looked directly at him with those quiet eyes that seemed to hold depths no one had bothered to explore, and simply said, "I hope so too, Lieutenant. I really do." Despite the constant humiliation, Linda maintained her professionalism with an almost saint-like patience. She rewrote safety checklists that were desperately needed, created detailed emergency protocols that could save lives, and even found time to repair broken training equipment with her own hands. But what none of them realized was that every slight, every dismissive comment, every cruel joke was being cataloged in the mind of someone who had once been considered one of the most dangerous people on the planet. Someone who had learned patience not in corporate seminars, but in situations where moving too soon meant death, and waiting for the perfect moment meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The storm was building behind Linda's quiet facade, and when it finally broke, it would shatter every assumption these soldiers had ever made about power, respect, and what it truly meant to be dangerous. The incident that began to change everything happened during routine weapons safety training on a humid Thursday morning. Private Jenkins, fresh from basic training and still carrying the invincibility complex of youth, was handling an M4 rifle with the kind of carelessness that made seasoned soldiers cringe. His finger rested casually on the trigger while he pointed the weapon toward other soldiers, waving it around like a prop while telling weekend stories about his exploits in town. The safety was off, and the magazine was loaded with training rounds still dangerous enough to cause serious injury or death. So there I was at Murphy's bar. Jenkins continued, gesturing wildly with the rifle, and this girl walks up to me and says, Linda moved faster than anyone thought possible. In one fluid motion, she crossed 20 feet of space, grabbed Jenkins' wrist with surprising strength, and redirected the rifle toward the ground. Her grip was like steel. Jenkins would later tell anyone who'd listen. It felt like machinery had caught his wrist. Muzzle discipline, she said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that made everyone in the room straighten instinctively. Rule number 1. Never point your weapon at anything you don't intend to destroy. But it wasn't just her speed that caught Sergeant Martinez's attention. It was how she moved. Her approach had been silent, calculated, using blind spots in Jenkins' peripheral vision. She'd neutralized the threat without alerting the soldier until it was too late. This wasn't something learned from PowerPoint safety presentations. This was muscle memory from someone who had lived in places where such reflexes meant survival. Jenkins, embarrassed and shaken, mumbled an apology and properly secured his weapon. The room fell silent, and for a moment, Linda's composed mask slipped just enough for those watching to see something darker underneath, a glimpse of someone who had seen what happened when weapon safety wasn't taken seriously. In real combat, Linda continued, her voice returning to its usual gentle tone, carelessness doesn't just kill you. It kills the people depending on you to bring them home. Martinez, a 20-year veteran with 3 Afghanistan tours under his belt, began watching Linda carefully during training sessions. He started noticing details others missed. She never sat with her back to doorways. When explaining evacuation procedures, she unconsciously positioned herself to see all entry and exit points. And during breaks, while other instructors chatted casually, Linda would scan rooms methodically, her eyes moving in patterns Martinez recognized from urban warfare training. That evening, Martinez decided to pull Linda's personnel file. The official record was surprisingly thin basic education credentials, CORPORAT training experience, some adult education certificates. Nothing that explained her presence on a military base or her intimate knowledge of combat protocols. But tucked in the back were 3 yellow documents that made Martinez's blood run cold. Commendations for L. Park from Joint Special Operations Command, dated 15 years earlier. The citations were heavily redacted, but certain phrases stood out. Extraordinary marksmanship under extreme conditions, single-handedly neutralized hostile positions, and recommended for classified recognition. Martinez started asking discreet questions around the base. A supply sergeant mentioned that Linda knew exact specifications for field medical kits that weren't even in current Inventory equipment used exclusively by Special Operations Units. During battlefield communications discussions, she'd casually reference radio protocols that were classified above Martinez's security clearance. When asked how she knew such things, Linda would smile sadly and say, "You pick things up over the years." The breakthrough came during advanced medical training the following week. Linda was demonstrating trauma care using training dummies, but her technique was far more sophisticated than standard first aid. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd performed these procedures under extreme stress, her hands steady, movements economical and precise. She explained pressure points for controlling bleeding that weren't in any manual Martinez had seen, demonstrated emergency airway insertion techniques that belonged in a surgeon's repertoire. When Corporal Williams asked where she'd learned such advanced skills, Linda paused, her hand still on the training dummy. For just a moment, her controlled expression slipped, and Martinez saw something flicker in her eyes, a darkness that spoke of places where such skills weren't theoretical exercises but desperate necessities. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you learn things because people die if you don't. And sometimes people die anyway, no matter how much you know." The room fell silent. Martinez felt chills as he recognized that look, the haunted expression of someone who'd held dying friends, made life and death split-second decisions, and carried the weight of others' survival. He'd seen it in mirrors after his worst deployments. That night, Martinez made quiet inquiries through old contacts, asking about legends and ghost stories from classified Southeast Asian operations. The name that kept coming up in whispered conversations was Whisper Hawk, a legendary sniper who had operated in some of the most dangerous territories on Earth. The story seemed almost fictional. Impossible shots in mountain terrain, entire enemy squads neutralized from distances that defied belief, rescue missions where death seemed certain but somehow everyone made it home. Nobody had ever seen Whisper Hawk's face. The operative was a ghost, a whisper on radio frequencies, a guardian angel who appeared when hope was lost and disappeared when safety was restored. As Martinez dug deeper, one detail kept recurring in the stories. Whisper Hawk's calling card was perfect silence, moving through hostile territory without disturbing so much as a leaf, taking shots that seemed impossible and vanishing without a trace. Just like the quiet woman who could cross a room full of soldiers without making a sound, who positioned herself with the tactical awareness of a combat veteran, and who carried herself with the controlled stillness of someone trained to kill. Martinez began to suspect that their PowerPoint lady was hiding the most dangerous secret on the entire base. Lieutenant Morrison's campaign against Linda reached its crescendo during the third week of October. What had started as casual mockery had evolved into something more sinister, a systematic effort to humiliate and undermine her at every opportunity. It began with small sabotages. Linda would arrive to find her carefully prepared training materials scattered, her projector mysteriously unplugged, or crude drawings of herself on the whiteboards. Someone had even replaced her coffee with decaf as a prank, leaving her to discover the switch during a particularly long training session. But Morrison wasn't content with childish pranks. During a joint training exercise with visiting units from Fort Bragg, he saw his opportunity to deliver what he hoped would be the final blow to Linda's credibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced to the assembled group of over 50 soldiers, "I'd like you to meet our expert tactical advisor." His voice dripped with sarcasm as he gestured toward Linda, who was quietly setting up her presentation. Equipment. She's going to teach us all about combat readiness from her extensive experience with PowerPoint animations. The laughter was cruel and widespread. Linda's hands paused over her laptop, and for a moment, Sergeant Martinez thought he saw them tremble slightly. But when she looked up, her expression remained composed, professional. "If you're ready, Lieutenant, she said quietly. "I'd like to begin with situational awareness protocols that could save lives in hostile environments." Morrison's grin widened. "Oh, we're all ready for your slideshow, ma'am. Please, educate us poor, dumb soldiers about the real world." The room erupted in laughter again, and this time, several of the visiting soldiers joined in. Linda stood there, absorbing the humiliation with the same quiet dignity she'd shown for months. But Martinez, watching from the back of the room, noticed something different about her posture. Her shoulders were squared, her feet positioned in what he now recognized as a combat stance. "Actually," Morrison continued, emboldened by his audience, "maybe we should test your knowledge practically. There's a weapons demonstration scheduled for this afternoon. Why don't you show us some of that tactical expertise you keep talking about?" The suggestion was clearly meant as a joke, a way to further embarrass Linda by putting her in a situation where she'd inevitably fail. But instead of declining or making excuses, Linda simply nodded. "I'd be happy to participate, Lieutenant. What did you have in mind?" Morrison's eyes lit up with malicious glee. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe start with some basic marksmanship? See if you can hit a target at, say, 300 meters? The crowd murmured with anticipation. 300 meters was challenging, even for trained infantry. For someone they assumed had never held a weapon outside of training videos, it would be impossible. "That sounds reasonable," Linda replied calmly. "Should we make it interesting?" Morrison's smile faltered slightly. He hadn't expected her to accept so readily, let alone suggest raising the stakes. "What do you mean?" "Well," Linda said, her voice maintaining that same gentle tone that had become so familiar, "if we're going to test tactical knowledge, we should make it relevant to real-world scenarios. How about we try some precision shooting at longer ranges? Say, 600 meters?" The room fell silent. 600 meters was serious distance shooting, requiring skills that most infantry soldiers never developed. Morrison realized he'd boxed himself into a corner, but backing down now would make him look weak in front of his audience. "Sure," he said, trying to sound confident. 600 meters it is. But when you miss, I want you to admit in front of everyone that your training is useless in the real world." Linda's smile was barely perceptible, but Martinez caught it. For the first time since arriving at Fort Davidson, she looked genuinely pleased. "And if I hit the target?" she asked. Morrison laughed. "If you hit anything at 600 meters, I'll personally apologize to you in front of the entire base." "That's a generous offer, Lieutenant," Linda replied. "I accept." As word spread about the impromptu shooting challenge, soldiers began gathering at the range. What had started as a cruel joke was turning into the most anticipated event on the base. Martinez found himself both excited and terrified about what might happen. He'd spent weeks piecing together clues about Linda's past, and his investigation had led him to some disturbing conclusions. The woman they'd been mocking might be one of the most dangerous people any of them had ever encountered. But even Martinez wasn't prepared for what was about to unfold. As Linda walked calmly toward the weapons rack, selecting a rifle with the familiarity of someone greeting an old friend, he realized that their PowerPoint lady was about to remind everyone that the most dangerous people are often the quietest ones. The afternoon sun beat down on the shooting range as Linda checked the rifle's mechanisms with practiced efficiency. Around her, dozens of soldiers gathered, most expecting to witness her humiliation. Instead, they were about to learn that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. Morrison stood nearby, basking in what he assumed would be his moment of triumph. He had no idea that he'd just challenged one of the most legendary snipers in military history to do what she did better than almost anyone alive. The target was set. The range was clear. And Linda Park was about to shatter every assumption these soldiers had ever made about power, skill, and respect. The shooting range at Fort Davidson had never hosted such a crowd. Word of the challenge between Lieutenant Morrison and the PowerPoint lady had spread through the base like wildfire, drawing soldiers from every unit. They came expecting entertainment, a chance to watch their least favorite instructor embarrass herself in spectacular fashion. Linda stood at the firing line, examining the M24 sniper rifle. She'd selected with the kind of thorough inspection that made Martinez's pulse quicken. Her hands moved over the weapon with intimate familiarity, checking the bolt action, testing the scope adjustment, examining the trigger mechanism. This wasn't someone learning equipment. This was someone who knew this rifle's capabilities better than its manufacturer. "Take your time," Morrison called out, his voice carrying false encouragement. "I know it's probably heavier than you expected." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Linda didn't respond, but Martinez noticed her breathing had changed. It was deeper, more controlled, the rhythm of a trained marksman preparing for a shot that mattered. The first target was set at 600 meters, exactly as Morrison had demanded. It was a standard bullseye, the kind most soldiers struggled to hit consistently at that distance even under perfect conditions. The October wind was picking up, adding another variable that would challenge even experienced shooters. Linda settled into prone position with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed. Her breathing slowed to the deep, controlled rhythm Martinez recognized from advanced sniper training. The crowd's laughter began to die as they watched her make minute scope adjustments, reading wind conditions with the expertise of someone who'd calculated such variables under life or death pressure. "Any day now," Morrison muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Linda's first shot rang out across the range. Through binoculars, the range officer called out, "Perfect center mass. Dead center of the bullseye." The crowd fell silent. Morrison's face flushed. "Lucky shot," he muttered, but even he seemed to realize how hollow the words sounded. Without ceremony, Linda chambered another round and waited for the second target to be set. This time, the range officer placed it at 800 meters, well beyond the distance most infantry soldiers could reliably engage targets. Her second shot was equally precise, punching through the center of the target with mechanical accuracy. No celebration, no reaction, just the professional competence of someone doing familiar work. By now, the gathered soldiers were exchanging confused glances. This wasn't the bumbling amateur they'd expected. This was something else entirely. Morrison, his earlier bravado evaporating, stepped forward. "Okay, you got lucky twice. Let's see how you do with a real challenge." He motioned to the range officer, who set up a target at 1,000 meters. At that distance, the target was barely visible even through a scope. Hitting it would require not just marksmanship, but an understanding of ballistics, wind drift, and atmospheric conditions that took years to master. "This is where it gets interesting," Morrison announced to the crowd, trying to regain his composure. 1,000 meters. That's serious distance shooting. Linda made careful adjustments to her scope, her movements deliberate and precise. She seemed to be calculating variables that the watching soldiers couldn't even identify. When she finally settled into position, the entire range fell silent. The shot rang out. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the range officer's voice crackled over the radio. "Target hit. Dead center." The silence stretched for several heartbeats before someone in the crowd whispered, "What the hell?" But Linda wasn't finished. Without looking up from her rifle, she spoke for the first time since taking position. "Lieutenant Morrison, you mentioned this was about tactical knowledge. In real combat situations, snipers often have to engage multiple targets rapidly. Would you like me to demonstrate?" Morrison's face had gone pale. He was beginning to realize that whatever game he thought he'd been playing, the rules had changed completely. "Set up 3 targets," Linda continued calmly. "Different distances. I'll engage them in sequence. The range officer, now fully invested in what was unfolding, quickly arranged targets at 600, 800, and 1,000 meters. The crowd pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Linda's breathing settled into that same controlled rhythm. Her first shot eliminated the 600-meter target. Without pausing, she adjusted and fired again. The 800-meter target disappeared. A third adjustment, a third shot, and the 1,000-meter target was gone. Total elapsed time, 47 seconds. The range erupted in stunned murmurs. This level of precision and speed was beyond anything most of these soldiers had ever witnessed. Martinez felt his suspicions crystallizing into certainty. From the back of the crowd, an older voice called out, "I know that shooting style." Everyone turned to see Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a grizzled veteran who rarely spoke but commanded respect whenever he did. He was staring at Linda with an expression of dawning recognition. 15 years ago, Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying across the silent range, my unit was pinned down by hostile fire in mountain terrain. 6 hours of hell, watching my men die one by one. No way out, no communication, no hope. He paused, removing his cap as if paying respects to fallen comrades. Then someone started taking out enemy positions. 6 shots, 6 kills, each over 1,200 meters in mountain conditions with crosswinds that would challenge any shooter. We never saw who was doing it. Just heard the call sign on emergency frequencies. Whisper Hawk. Area secure. Extract your people. Every eye turned to Linda, who was carefully setting the rifle back on its rest. She stood slowly, brushing dust from her khakis with the same methodical care she applied to everything else. I didn't come here to be remembered, she said, her voice carrying that same gentle tone they'd heard in hundreds of training sessions. I came here so all of you can go home safely to your families. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was absolute. Word spread through Fort Davidson like wildfire. The PowerPoint lady was Whisper Hawk, one of military special operations' most legendary snipers. The woman they'd mocked and dismissed had been hiding in plain sight, carrying secrets that could fill a dozen classified files. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Martinez approached Linda. She was methodically cleaning the rifle she'd used, treating it with the reverence of someone who understood that such tools were the difference between life and death. Ma'am, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. We all do. Linda looked up at him with those quiet eyes that now seemed to hold depths of experience no PowerPoint presentation could convey. No apologies necessary, Sergeant, she replied. You didn't know. That was the point. The morning after Linda's shooting demonstration, Fort Davidson felt like a different place. Word of Whisper Hawk's true identity had spread beyond the base, reaching military networks across multiple installations. By 06 o'clock hours, Linda's small office had received calls from Joint Special Operations Command, the Pentagon, and 3 different military intelligence agencies. Lieutenant Morrison hadn't slept. He'd spent the night researching everything he could find about Whisper Hawk, and what he discovered made his blood run cold. The classified operations, the impossible missions, the lives saved. He'd been systematically humiliating a living legend for months. He found Linda in her office at dawn, preparing training materials with the same meticulous care she'd always shown. She looked up when he knocked, her expression neutral and professional. Lieutenant, she said quietly, how can I help you? Morrison's prepared apology died in his throat. Standing before him wasn't the woman he'd tormented, but someone whose very presence commanded a respect he'd never bothered to recognize. He'd spent months trying to break her spirit, never realizing that her spirit had been forged in places where his nightmares couldn't reach. I need to apologize, he stammered. What I did to you, what I said. I had no idea who you were. Linda set down her papers and studied him with those quiet eyes that seemed to see everything. Would it have mattered if you had known? The question cut deeper than any reprimand. Morrison realized she was asking whether his respect was based on her identity or her humanity, whether he would have treated any other instructor with basic dignity regardless of their background. His silence was answer enough. Lieutenant, Linda continued, her voice gentle but firm, respect isn't something you earn through past accomplishments. It's something you give to others because they deserve it as human beings. The person you chose to humiliate was the same person who stood on that firing range yesterday. The only thing that changed was your perception. Morrison felt the weight of her words. Every cruel joke, every dismissive comment, every moment of calculated humiliation came flooding back. He'd revealed something ugly about himself that couldn't be taken back. I'll submit a formal apology to your file, he said weakly. Linda shook her head. That's not necessary. But I do need you to understand something important. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds, where soldiers were already gathering for morning exercises. Many of them had been at the shooting range the day before, and their demeanor toward the base's training protocols had noticeably shifted overnight. Every person you meet is carrying experiences you can't imagine, she said. The soldier who seems too quiet might be dealing with trauma you've never faced. The instructor who appears weak might have strengths you can't comprehend. When you choose to tear someone down based on assumptions, you reveal more about yourself than about them. Morrison watched the training grounds where soldiers now moved with a different kind of attention to detail. Linda's influence was already visible in their improved focus, their genuine engagement with safety protocols, their newfound respect for the fundamentals that kept them alive. The question isn't whether you can make up for what you did, Linda continued. The question is whether you can learn to see people's value before they prove it to you in ways you can't ignore. Later that morning, Colonel Matthews requested a private meeting with Linda. His office was filled with commendations and photos from a distinguished career, but he seemed almost nervous as she entered. Ms. Park, he began, then paused. I'm not sure how to address you properly. Your service record. What I've been able to access, it's extraordinary. Linda took the offered seat, maintaining the same composed demeanor she'd shown throughout her time at Fort Davidson. Linda is fine, sir. I'm here as a civilian trainer. That's what I need to discuss, Matthews said. After yesterday's demonstration, I've received calls from people I didn't know had my number. There are questions about your presence here, your current assignment, your availability for certain projects. He slid a folder across his desk. Inside were orders that would have taken Linda away from Fort Davidson immediately, reassigning her to classified operations that matched her legendary skills. Linda examined the papers briefly, then closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk. I appreciate the offers, Colonel, but I'm exactly where I need to be. Matthews frowned. You could be leading special operations training, working with elite units, consulting on the highest level missions. Why stay here teaching basic protocols to regular infantry? Linda's answer came without hesitation. Because these soldiers matter just as much as any elite unit. They deserve the best training available, even if they never know where it comes from. In my previous work, I saved lives by taking them. Here, I save lives by giving people the knowledge they need to protect themselves and others. She paused, glancing out the window at the soldiers who were now taking their training seriously for the first time in months. Besides, she added with a slight smile, I think I'm finally where I can do the most good. Matthews studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll inform the interested parties that you're unavailable for reassignment. But I want you to know, Miss Park, that your impact here goes beyond training. You've reminded us all that excellence can exist in any form, and that respect should be given freely, not earned through demonstrations. As Linda left the colonel's office, she passed Morrison in the hallway. He straightened instinctively, then caught himself. She nodded politely and continued walking, but he noticed something different in her bearing. She carried herself with the same quiet confidence she'd always shown, but now everyone around her recognized it for what it was, not the timidity of someone trying to avoid conflict, but the stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove. The afternoon brought the first of many changes to Fort Davidson's training protocols. Soldiers who had previously treated Linda's sessions as unwelcome interruptions now arrived early, took detailed notes, and asked thoughtful questions about survival techniques they'd previously ignored. Private Henderson, the unit's designated marksman, approached Linda after her advanced medical training session. "Miss Park," he said hesitantly, "would you be willing to provide some additional shooting instruction? I mean, if you have time." Linda smiled, not the polite, professional smile she'd worn for months, but something warmer and more genuine. "I'd be happy to help, Henderson. But remember, marksmanship is only one part of being an effective soldier. The most important skills are the ones that prevent you from needing to take a shot in the first place." As evening fell over Fort Davidson, Linda gathered her materials and prepared to leave for the day. The base felt different, now more focused, more respectful, more aware of the hidden depths that people might carry. She'd accomplished something that no amount of shouting or demanding could have achieved. She'd earned genuine respect by staying true to herself and letting her actions speak louder than her words. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to teach and learn. But tonight, Linda Park could go home knowing that she'd found her true mission not in the shadows of classified operations, but in the steady, patient work of preparing others to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The weeks following Linda's revelation transformed Fort Davidson in ways that went far beyond improved marksmanship scores. The change was subtle but pervasive, like ripples spreading across still water. Soldiers who had previously sleepwalked through training sessions now arrived early, stayed late, and approached their duties with a newfound sense of purpose. Linda's office, once a place where soldiers went only when forced, became an unofficial pilgrimage site. Young soldiers found excuses to visit, hoping to learn something from the living legend hidden among them. But Linda never spoke about past operations, never shared war stories, or boasted about accomplishments. Instead, she taught fundamentals, the unglamorous skills that kept soldiers alive: situational awareness, equipment maintenance, medical basics, and the importance of never taking shortcuts when lives were at stake. Private Henderson had become her most devoted student. Under Linda's quiet guidance, he progressed from struggling with 300-meter shots to consistently hitting targets at 800 meters. His improvement was remarkable, but it was more than just technical skill. Linda had taught him patience, breathing, control, and the mental discipline required for precision work. When Henderson achieved qualification scores for advanced sniper school, an opportunity that could define his military career, he had a small metal plate made, engraved with simple words, "Taught by PowerPoint lady, the deadliest instructor in the Army." He placed it on his desk in the barracks, where it became a conversation starter for visitors from other units. The transformation extended beyond individual soldiers to the base culture itself. Someone nobody ever admitted who hung a small wooden sign above the projector in Linda's training room. "The quieter you are, the louder your bullet speaks." Linda never acknowledged the sign, but she never removed it either. Sergeant Martinez found himself completely reassessing his own leadership style. He'd spent 20 years in the military, believing that authority came from rank and volume, that respect was commanded through strength and intimidation. Linda had shown him a different model, one where real authority came from competence, wisdom, and the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. "She's changing how we think about everything," Martinez confided to his wife during one of their evening phone calls. "Not just shooting, not just tactics, everything. The way we treat each other, the way we approach problems, the way we define strength." The most dramatic change came from Lieutenant Morrison himself. His encounter with Linda had shattered something fundamental in his worldview. He'd built his identity around being the loudest, most aggressive person in the room, mistaking noise for leadership and cruelty for strength. Now he found himself questioning every interaction, every assumption, every moment where he'd chosen to tear someone down rather than build them up. He began observing Linda's teaching methods, trying to understand how she commanded such complete attention without ever raising her voice. Her secret, he realized, wasn't in demanding respect, but in giving it freely to others. She listened to every question, no matter how basic. She acknowledged every contribution, no matter how small. She created an environment where people felt safe to admit what they didn't know, which paradoxically made them more eager to learn. Morrison started implementing these techniques with his own soldiers. Instead of shouting corrections, he offered quiet guidance. Instead of public humiliation for mistakes, he provided private instruction. The results were immediate and dramatic. His unit's performance improved across every metric. And more importantly, they began approaching their duties with genuine enthusiasm rather than grudging compliance. But the most significant change was happening within Linda herself. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The classified missions, the impossible shots, the life or death decisions, they had all been leading to this moment, this opportunity to share her knowledge in a way that could save lives without taking them. She established what became known as evening sessions, voluntary training periods where soldiers could explore advanced techniques in a relaxed environment. These sessions covered everything from long-range shooting to advanced first aid, from tactical movement to psychological preparation for high-stress situations. The evening sessions became so popular that soldiers from neighboring bases began requesting permission to attend. Linda welcomed them all, turning Fort Davidson into an unofficial center of excellence for practical military training. Colonel Matthews received commendations from multiple commanding officers whose soldiers had trained with Linda. Equipment failures decreased, training accidents disappeared entirely, and overall unit readiness improved dramatically. The base that had once been considered a routine assignment became a coveted posting for soldiers serious about professional development. One evening, as Linda was packing up after a particularly successful training session on combat medical procedures, she found Morrison waiting outside her office. He'd been coming by regularly, not to apologize again. She'd made it clear that wasn't necessary, but to seek guidance on becoming a better leader. "I've been thinking about what you said," Morrison began, "about seeing people's value before they prove it to you. I realized I've been doing this wrong my entire career." Linda invited him into her office, which had transformed from a sterile administrative space into something warmer and more welcoming. Photos of successful training graduates lined the walls, and a small bookshelf held technical manuals alongside personal development books that soldiers often borrowed. "Leadership isn't about what you've done," Linda said, settling into her chair. "It's about what you enable others to do." The most successful operations I was ever part of weren't about my individual performance. They were about creating conditions where everyone could perform at their best. Morrison nodded, absorbing the lesson. "How do you do it? How do you make people want to exceed their own expectations?" Linda smiled. "You start by believing they can. People rise to meet genuine expectations, but they also sink to meet false ones. If you treat someone like they're incompetent, they'll start believing it themselves. But if you treat them like they're capable of extraordinary things, they'll often surprise you." Morrison thought about his own soldiers, how his previous approach had created a culture of fear rather than excellence. What about when someone actually is struggling, when they're not meeting standards? Then you figure out why, Linda replied. Are they lacking knowledge, skills, confidence, resources? Most performance problems aren't about ability. They're about obstacles that can be removed or overcome. Your job as a leader is to identify those obstacles and help eliminate them. As their conversation continued, Morrison realized he was receiving a master class in leadership from someone who had commanded respect in the world's most dangerous environments. But more than that, he was learning how to see potential in people, rather than just their current limitations. 3 months after Linda's shooting demonstration, Fort Davidson faced its most serious challenge in years. A joint training exercise with multiple international units was scheduled, a high-profile event that would test every aspect of the base's readiness. Success would bring recognition and additional resources. Failure would result in budget cuts and reassignments that could devastate careers. The exercise, codenamed Iron Guardian, would simulate a complex humanitarian crisis requiring precise coordination between infantry, medical, logistics, and communications units. International observers from 12 allied nations would evaluate every aspect of the operation, from initial response to final mission completion. Colonel Matthews called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. The pressure was enormous. Fort Davidson's reputation, and potentially his own career, hung in the balance. Ladies and gentlemen, Matthews began, Iron Guardian represents the most comprehensive evaluation this base has ever faced. We have 6 weeks to demonstrate that Fort Davidson produces soldiers capable of handling the most challenging scenarios our allies can devise. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Previous joint exercises had exposed weaknesses in coordination, communication, and crisis response that had taken months to address. Now they are expected to perform flawlessly under international scrutiny. What are our biggest vulnerabilities? Matthews asked. Major Rodriguez spoke first. Medical response times are still inconsistent. We've improved, but under stress, coordination breaks down between units. Captain Williams added, long-range reconnaissance and target identification remain problematic. Our marksmen are good, but not at the level required for the precision scenarios they're planning. Lieutenant Morrison, now transformed by his experience, with Linda, offered a different perspective. Sir, I think our real challenge isn't technical skills, it's confidence. Our soldiers have the training, but they don't believe in themselves enough to perform under pressure. Matthews nodded grimly. These were exactly the issues that had plagued previous exercises. Solutions? The room fell silent. Traditional approaches, more drills, extended training hours, additional equipment had yielded marginal improvements at best. They needed something different, something that could transform capable soldiers into exceptional ones in just 6 weeks. What? About Linda? Morrison suggested quietly. Every head turned toward him. Since his encounter with the legendary sniper, Morrison had become one of Linda's strongest advocates, but this suggestion surprised even his colleagues. Explain, Matthews said. Morrison took a breath. She's been working with individuals and small groups, but we've never leveraged her full capabilities for a major operation. What if we made her lead coordinator for Iron Guardian preparation? Major Rodriguez frowned. She's a civilian contractor assigned to basic training protocols. She's Whisperhawk, Morrison replied firmly. She successfully completed operations, more complex than anything we'll face in Iron Guardian. More importantly, she's already proven she can transform how our soldiers think and perform. Matthews considered the proposal. It was unconventional, potentially risky, and would require convincing higher command to expand Linda's authority significantly. But the alternative facing Iron Guardian with their current limitations seemed far more dangerous. "I'll need to make some calls," Matthew said finally. "If we're going to do this, we'll need official authorization from Ms. Park to take charge of exercise preparation." 2 days later, Linda found herself in a position she'd never expected, leading the most important training operation in Fort Davidson's recent history. The irony wasn't lost on her months earlier. Soldiers had mocked her authority to teach basic safety protocols. Now she was responsible for preparing them for the most demanding evaluation of their careers. Her first action was to assemble what she called the core team, representatives from every unit who would coordinate individual elements of the exercise. But instead of choosing based on rank or seniority, Linda selected soldiers who had shown genuine commitment to improvement during her training sessions. Private Henderson found himself leading the marksmanship preparation team. Corporal Williams, who had impressed Linda with thoughtful questions during medical training, became head of crisis response coordination. Even Morrison, despite his earlier antagonism, was chosen to lead the communication integration effort. "Why these people?" Major Rodriguez asked during Linda's first briefing with senior staff. "Some of them are barely out of basic training." Linda's response was characteristically direct. "Because they understand that excellence comes from continuous learning, not just accumulated experience. They've already proven they can adapt, improve, and take feedback constructively. Those are the qualities we need for Iron Guardian." Her approach to preparation was unlike anything the base had seen before. Instead of focusing solely on technical skills, Linda emphasized the psychological and social elements that determine success under pressure. She organized cross-unit teams that forced soldiers from different specialties to work together, creating artificial stress through time constraints and unexpected complications. "In real crises," Linda explained during one of her planning sessions, "your biggest enemy isn't the technical challenge. It's panic, confusion, and breakdown of communication. We're going to train you to maintain clarity and coordination when everything is falling apart." The training scenarios Linda developed were ingeniously complex. Medical teams would start treating casualties only to discover their supplies were contaminated, forcing them to improvise with limited resources. Marksmanship teams would begin exercises with perfect conditions, then face sudden weather changes, equipment failures, and time pressure that tested their ability to adapt. Most importantly, Linda created scenarios where individual excellence meant nothing without team coordination. The best marksman couldn't succeed if communication failed. The most skilled medic couldn't save lives if logistics broke down. Every soldier learned that their personal performance was meaningless unless it contributed to collective success. As the weeks progressed, something remarkable began happening. The artificial barriers between units started dissolving. Soldiers, who had previously worked in isolation, began collaborating naturally. Henderson's marksmen coordinated with Williams' medical teams to ensure wounded personnel could be evacuated safely. Morrison's communication specialists embedded with every other unit to guarantee information flow remained intact under pressure. The transformation was so dramatic that visiting officers from other bases began requesting permission to observe Fort Davidson's training methods. Word spread through military networks that something special was happening at the installation that had once been considered unremarkable. But Linda knew the real test wasn't in controlled training scenarios, it was in how her soldiers would perform when everything they'd learned was put to the ultimate test under international observation. Iron Guardian would reveal whether months of patient instruction could create the kind of excellence that would define careers and save lives. With 2 weeks remaining before the exercise, Linda gathered her core team for a final assessment. Looking around the room at faces that had become familiar, she saw something that filled her with quiet pride. These weren't the same soldiers who had dismissed her presentations months earlier. They had become something more professionals who understood that true strength came not from individual prowess, but from collective excellence. "You're ready," she told them simply. "Trust your training, trust each other, and remember that everything we've practiced has prepared you for this moment." Iron Guardian would be their graduation exam, and Linda was confident her students were ready to exceed every expectation. The morning of Iron Guardian dawned gray and cold, with a biting wind that seemed to cut through even the heaviest winter gear. International observers from 12 allied nations had arrived at Fort Davidson, their faces showing the skeptical professionalism of career military officers who had seen countless exercises and were impressed by very few. The scenario was brutal. In its complexity, a simulated natural disaster had created a humanitarian crisis requiring immediate response. Multiple casualties needed evacuation, hostile forces threatened civilian populations, and communication infrastructure had been severely damaged. Success required flawless coordination between medical, combat, logistics, and intelligence units. Under extreme time pressure, Linda stood in the command center, no longer the dismissed PowerPoint lady, but the architect of what was about to unfold. She wore her usual pressed khakis and sensible shoes, but her bearing had changed subtly. The observers who didn't know her background saw a civilian contractor. Those who did understand her history watched with respectful attention. Colonel Matthews opened the exercise with formal remarks to the international delegation. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Fort Davidson. Today, you'll observe our response to a complex crisis scenario designed to test every aspect of our operational readiness." The British observer, a stern-faced colonel named Harrison, checked his watch. "We're particularly interested in your coordination protocols. Previous American exercises have shown excellent individual unit performance, but concerning gaps in inter-unit communication." Matthews nodded diplomatically, but Linda noticed the tension in his shoulders. The international community's assessment of American military readiness had been mixed in recent years, with several high-profile coordination failures during joint operations. Fort Davidson's performance today would contribute to those broader perceptions. At precisely 08 o'clock hours, the exercise began. The first phase simulated the immediate aftermath of a major earthquake. Casualty reports flooded in from multiple locations. Civilian populations required evacuation, and hostile forces were exploiting the chaos to advance on strategic positions. Most bases would have descended into managed chaos as different units struggled to prioritize competing emergencies. Instead, Fort Davidson responded with mechanical precision. Henderson's marksmanship teams immediately established overwatch positions, providing security for medical personnel while simultaneously conducting reconnaissance on hostile positions. Their coordination was seamless. Each sniper knew exactly which sectors they were responsible for, how to communicate target information, and when to engage without conflicting with other operations. Williams' medical teams moved with efficiency that impressed even the veteran observers. Instead of rushing toward casualties individually, they operated in coordinated cells that could treat injuries while maintaining defensive positions. Their supply chains were optimized to prevent shortages, and their evacuation procedures ensured wounded personnel reached appropriate care levels without overwhelming any single facility. Morrison's communication teams had transformed from an administrative afterthought into the central nervous system of the entire operation. Information flowed smoothly between units. Priorities were communicated clearly, and when equipment failures occurred, as Linda had programmed them to back up, systems activated without missing a beat. But it was the integration between units that truly amazed the observers. When Henderson's teams identified hostile positions threatening medical evacuations, they didn't just engage the targets, they coordinated with Morrison's communication. specialists to vector in close air support while simultaneously alerting Williams' medical teams to prepare for potential additional casualties. "Extraordinary," murmured the German observer, General Weber. "I've never seen American units coordinate with this level of sophistication." The exercise intensified as planned complications unfolded. Supply lines were severed, communication equipment failed, weather conditions deteriorated, and casualties multiplied beyond initial projections. These were the conditions that typically revealed weaknesses in training and preparation. Fort Davidson's response was to adapt and overcome. When primary communication systems failed, Morrison's teams seamlessly switched to backup protocols that maintained coordination. When medical supplies ran low, Williams' teams implemented rationing procedures that maximized care effectiveness. When weather made long-range shooting nearly impossible, Henderson's marksmen adjusted techniques and engaged targets at closer ranges with different weapon systems. The observers began taking detailed notes. Colonel Harrison, the skeptical British officer, was photographing tactical displays and requesting copies of coordination protocols. General Weber asked for permission to interview unit leaders about their training methods. By the midpoint of the exercise, Linda knew they had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. But the most revealing moment came during the crisis escalation phase, when multiple emergencies occurred simultaneously and traditional command structures would typically break down. A simulated chemical attack created mass casualties requiring specialized medical response. Hostile forces launched a coordinated assault on evacuation routes. Communication equipment suffered catastrophic failure. Weather conditions deteriorated to near impossible operating levels. Most units would have been forced to choose between competing priorities, accepting failure in some areas to maintain performance in others. Fort Davidson's soldiers didn't just maintain performance, they exceeded it. Medical teams deployed chemical response protocols while simultaneously treating CONVENTIONL injuries. Marksmanship teams engaged hostile forces while providing covering fire for evacuations. Communication specialists restored information flow using improvised equipment and alternative frequencies. Every unit adapted to changing conditions while maintaining perfect coordination with others. The international observers exchanged amazed glances. This wasn't just good training. This was military excellence at a level that set new standards for inter-unit cooperation. As the exercise reached its climax, Linda found herself standing beside Colonel Matthews in the command center. Around them, soldiers executed complex maneuvers with precision that would have been impossible months earlier. The transformation was complete. These weren't the same people who had dismissed her authority and mocked her presentations. "Ms. Park," Matthews said quietly, "I need you to know that what you've accomplished here goes far beyond a successful exercise. You've changed how we think about training, leadership, and what's possible when people work together." Linda watched. Henderson coordinated a particularly complex shot that protected civilian evacuees while Morrison's teams called in medical support for wounded soldiers. These moments when training became life-saving action were why she'd chosen to stay at Fort Davidson rather than return to classified operations. "They did this themselves, Colonel," Linda replied. "I just created conditions where they could discover what they were capable of." The exercise concluded with flawless execution of the final evacuation phase. Every casualty had been treated and transported to appropriate care facilities. All hostile threats had been neutralized. Civilian populations had been protected and relocated. Communication had been maintained throughout the operation despite multiple equipment failures. Most importantly, every soldier had performed not just as an individual specialist, but as part of a larger organism that adapted, overcame, and succeeded under impossible conditions. During the post-exercise briefing, the international observers delivered their assessments. Colonel Harrison spoke first. In 30 years of military service, I have never observed coordination of this quality. Fort Davidson has demonstrated inter-unit cooperation that exceeds NATO standards and sets new benchmarks for crisis response. General Weber added, "Your training methodology should be studied and implemented across allied forces." The level of adaptability and teamwork we witness today represents a fundamental advancement in military readiness. But the most meaningful recognition came from Linda's own soldiers. As the observers departed and equipment was secured, Henderson approached her with something he'd been working on during his off-duty hours. It was a wooden plaque, carefully carved and polished, bearing simple words, dedicated to the PowerPoint lady, who taught us that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous, and that true strength comes from lifting others up. Below the inscription were signatures from every soldier who had participated in Iron Guardian, along with personal notes of gratitude for lessons that extended far beyond military training. Linda accepted the plaque with uncharacteristic emotion. For someone who had spent years operating in shadows, being acknowledged by people whose lives she had genuinely improved felt like the most meaningful recognition of her career. "Thank you," she said simply. "All of you." As evening fell over Fort Davidson, Linda packed up her materials one final time. Not because she was leaving. Colonel Matthews had already authorized her permanent position as Director of Advanced Training Coordination, but because this chapter of her story was complete. She had arrived as a dismissed civilian contractor and revealed herself as a legendary sniper. But her true transformation was something deeper. From someone who saved lives by taking them to someone who saved lives by teaching others to save themselves. The soldiers of Fort Davidson would carry her lessons to assignments around the world, spreading techniques and attitudes that would ripple through military organizations for years to come. They would teach other soldiers about the importance of teamwork, adaptability, and the quiet confidence that comes from thorough preparation. Most importantly, they would remember that excellence can exist in any form. That respect should be given freely rather than earned through demonstration, and that the most dangerous person in any room might just be the one saying the least. Linda Park had found her true mission at last, not in the spectacular individual achievements that made legends, but in the patient, unglamorous work of making others better than they ever imagined they could be. And in doing so, she had become something more than Whisperhawk, more than a legendary sniper, more than a tactical instructor. She had become a teacher in the truest sense, someone who had changed lives by believing in potential that others couldn't see. The PowerPoint lady had gotten the last laugh after all, not through revenge or humiliation, but through the quiet satisfaction of watching dismissed assumptions crumble in the face of extraordinary results. True victory, Linda had learned, wasn't about proving doubters wrong. It was about helping others become so much better that those doubts became irrelevant. Years later, soldiers trained under Linda Park would tell new recruits about the PowerPoint lady. They'd explain how she saved more lives through unglamorous training sessions than most soldiers saved through heroic battlefield actions. She taught them that true strength was often invisible, that real heroes worked in silence, and that the most dangerous person in any room was usually the one saying the least. Her legacy lived on not in medals or commendations, but in techniques passed down through generations of military personnel, in lives saved by soldiers who remembered her lessons about preparation and teamwork, and in a fundamental shift in how the military thought about respect, authority, and the hidden potential that exists in every person. Linda Park never sought recognition for her legendary past. Her greatest pride came from graduation ceremonies, watching soldiers she'd trained receive assignments around the world, knowing her lessons might someday bring them home alive. In her quiet way, She'd found a new mission, not taking lives from a distance, but saving them through preparation, training, and the patient dedication that only comes from understanding the true cost of carelessness. The transformation was complete. The PowerPoint lady had become something far more powerful than Whisper Hawk had ever been. A teacher who changed the world one student at a time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.